Hello everyone. In today's class session, I want to follow on class session 1 and 2 and discuss with you research approaches and research designs. If you can remember from those previous class sessions, methodology is the practical side of our research beliefs. So besides having a specific belief about reality, about knowledge, about values and ethics, we also have specific beliefs about how to go about conducting research. And the methodological considerations are those how to go about conducting research. Now, methodology, we can broadly differentiate between research approaches, like that's the general orientation towards research, and the research design. That is more the specific way that methods are put together, the specific way that the project is put together. So let's talk about research approaches first. Now, what is a research approach? When I say research approach, I am referring to the general methodological orientation of a study, qualitative, quantitative, multi-method, and so on. Research design is then the overarching framework or plan for that research project. We will talk about that in the next section, but in textbooks and scholarly works, you will see a variety of terms referring to this. Sometimes it's called the research paradigm, research strategy, methodological orientation, and so on. It's even called research design interchangeably sometimes. In principle, what you call it is not necessarily important, but you must be consistent in your terminology, and you should also think about that bigger orientation as well as the more specific recipe or plan for your research. How do I choose a research approach? In traditional Western, Euro-Western research, we generally have qualitative and quantitative research as the two opposing branches. While there are different opinions on this, it is in a general sense we can say that quantitative research is associated with positivism or post-positivism, and qualitative approaches with interpretivism, constructivism, some transformative and critical work, and also some decal, indigenous, and post-col work. Multi and mixed method approaches are usually associated with pragmatism and some parts of transformative and critical work, as well as some decal or indigenous post-col work. While it's generally true that particular paradigms might be associated with specific research approaches, there are many instances where an interpretivist can make use of quantitative methods to, for instance, supplement a dominant qualitative approach, or where pragmatists do not necessarily use mixed methods because the specific situation called for a mono-method approach. There's also a space in between these Euro-Western qualitative, quantitative categories, and some decal studies might not want to label an approach as either qualitative or quantitative. To decide on an approach, you have to think of many things together. Your paradigmatic position in the first place, sure, but also your research topic or the problem you are wanting to address through your research, the specific setting or context of your study, your discipline, and what is generally done in studies such as yours. And then also some practical matters of feasibility and what is possible to actually execute in the real world. The easiest way to understand qualitative and quantitative is by comparing them. So I will do that. Quantitative research usually involves numerical data that is usually analyzed by doing statistical calculations. Qualitative research is in essence non-numerical. So it's written and spoken language and images, phenomena, interpretations, and so on. On a deeper level, these different types of data are about different orientations. Quantitative research is about standard ways of doing things. It's about exactness, generalizability, about proof and evidence, where qualitative methods are about understanding, in-depth work, detail, openness, and connection. Let's take a study about social media marketing, for example. Companies that market their products through influencers are interested in the accounts of these social media influencers, as they use those account data to calculate follower reach, engagement, growth, reach, and so on. Now, that's all quantitative stuff. The number of followers, number of likes, number of comments, number of shares. But you can also be interested in other equally important things about, for instance, an Instagram influencer. The quality of the content, the image they project, what they represent, and how their followers react. These things are all qualitative. You cannot say any of them through knowing the number of followers and likes and so on. So can you see how both approaches have a place, depending on what it is you want to know and what you value and other contextual factors of your study? You will decide on an overarching approach to your work. Also, can you see the link with the deeper philosophical questions? In research terms, we can say that quantitative and qualitative research have different ontological and epistemological assumptions that are foundational to them. Quantitative research has an objectivist ontology and an empiricist epistemology, where qualitative research has a constructionist ontology and an interpretative epistemology. On the screen, you can see more of the broad stroke different characteristics. Quantitative approaches are different from qualitative in the purpose for which they are conducted. They have different processes. They generate different types of data. They are different in how they make meaning from data and how the findings are communicated. However, sometimes we don't want to just have a qualitative or just a quantitative approach, but we feel the need to combine aspects of both in different versions of multi-method approaches. Let's talk about that next. Many research paradigms like pragmatism, critical realism, transformative critical research lend themselves to allow for mixing or combining different methods into one research design. If you are doing organizational research, you might have an interpretative stance and use a generally qualitative approach. You choose a case study design to focus on understanding a communication phenomenon in one organization. But to get the best understanding of the issue, you opt to use both a quantitative survey and qualitative interviews. Can you see how these things can work together? You can also be a researcher, for instance, that comes from a critical tradition that uses discourse analysis of both textual visual aspects of email communication between managers and staff members of an organization, and you combine that with, say, interviews, interview data of interviews with staff members about their relationships with management. So these are both qualitative methods, the interviews as well as the discourse analysis, but they are still used together in one research study. On the screen is a flowchart type thing that shows some of your options here. On the left, you see mono method, but then towards the right, you can see different options for multi-method studies. Multi-method studies are those that combine more than one research method in one study. You can get multi-method qualitative or multi-method quantitative studies where you use multiple methods from one approach. So 2 or more qualitative methods used together in a study, in a qualitative study, or 2 or more quantitative methods used together in a quantitative study. In other words, you use multiple methods, but you don't cross the line between qualitative and quantitative. So you don't mix methods. Mixed methods refer to crossing that line between qualitative and quantitative. Then you get mixed method research where you combine quantitative and qualitative methods in one design. And there are also two types here. The first is mixed method research. This one is probably best known. It is where you use both qualitative and quantitative methods, but they stay what they are. You analyze them each separately and might offer an overall integration when it comes to drawing conclusions, but your quantitative data is analyzed quantitatively and your qualitative data is analyzed quantitatively. There's some reasons for you to do this, this combination of methods, this mixed method study. You may want to use two methods so that one can strengthen or corroborate or improve validity and reliability. This is called methodological triangulation. Methodological triangulation is when methods help one another. This means that they are not focused on different things, but they are focused on the same thing. And that the convergence, complement, contradictions, or whatever you find from combining the findings say something about the validity, reliability, trustworthiness, strength of your data. You cannot call it triangulation if the two methods are used to cover different research questions, for instance. To make this more complicated, you can also triangulate other things other than methods. You can triangulate data sources or investigators or theoretical approaches. But for this discussion, we are talking about methodological triangulation, not the rest. If you are mixing methods for other reasons than the two methods corroborating each other, you are still mixing methods, but you are not triangulating. Other reasons for mixed method research includes facilitation, where one method is used to facilitate the other. Like when you do interviews, but the interviews are done for you to refine your survey questionnaire. Or where you do an observation of a social media page to get a feeling for what's going on, in other words, to explore things before you dive into a critical discourse analysis. Another reason can be when they complement each other. For example, if you do a questionnaire-based survey and then use interviews to fill in the gaps of meaning and understanding that you can't really get from like short multiple choice type of questions from a questionnaire. For instance, the survey might ask respondents about their attitudes towards a certain bank group, and then interview data is used to further expand on those attitudes by giving more detail. Then there's the reason of generality. This is where one method is used to show the importance of your specific study before you move on to your actual main method. For instance, you can conduct interviews with female mine workers about their inclusion in safety communication processes and then use those findings to show there is a real problem on this theme. This becomes the motivation for you to say, this is why this research is important. You can also mix methods when one helps with the interpretation of another, or when you need different methods to solve a problem left unanswered by your first method or methods. There are also those mixing of methods that is used to cover different aspects of your research, like answering different research questions through different methods. For example, you use quantitative content analysis to measure statistically how prevalent is the use of certain exclusionary or marginalizing words and phrases in communication or whatever topic. This will be about counting and calculating and categorizing words and phrases in a specific and exact way. You can then answer another research question about what these words and phrases mean to people and what feelings they conjure up when they are read or heard by talking to people through sparsely structured interviews. So these two methods are used in the same study, but they answer different research questions or focus on different aspects of the research. Okay, so that was now mixed methods, but there's another maybe lesser known multi-method approach called a mixed model approach, where quantitative data is qualitatively interpreted or qualitative data is quantified in some way. Examples here that you might are that you might have conducted a quantitative questionnaire-based survey, done the analysis and interpreted the whole thing statistically, but then your quantitative findings are used as a document of text that is then thematically analyzed and thereby qualitizing your quantitative data. There is also the possibility that you conducted, for instance, focus group interviews that are generally a qualitative method. But then you took those transcriptions, the texts, and analyzed it quantitatively by looking at the number of times participants said a specific word or expressed a specific emotion or quantify the themes that emerge from the data, but in a quantitative way. So then you can say throughout the 6 focus group, the issue of gender-based violence in the workplace was raised a total of 46 times by 12 different people. So such a mixing of things, mixing up qualitative and quantitative things, are typically called a mixed model research approach. Okay, I hope you're with me. Next, I want to talk about the spaces in between qualitative, quantitative, and mixing and multi-methods. There is a growing number of research approaches that are stepping away from this typology in a search for a more suitable way of expressing lived experiences and realities that don't really fit into this frame. Such a move away from the categories of qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods could also be an act or position of decolonization in itself. This space in between the conventional Western categories is an exciting and emerging way to do research. You can explore what I call here the space in between in various ways. You can choose whether you want to be radical or not, and not use qualitative, quantitative, mixed at all. Or you can be more conventional and customize a qualitative method, or use a method associated with decolonial research but still call it a qualitative approach. You can even be inspired by the contextual relevance of thinking outside of the Western box, even if you are not working from a decolonial worldview or a transformational stance or so on. This is the new frontier, and it's about pushing boundaries and spanning boundaries, confronting boundaries, rejecting boundaries, rebelling against categories, in kind of a celebration of who you are, of our collective Africanness, or the pain of our Africanness. I want to talk about 3 things here. The first is integrative approaches. Now, this idea of the space in between approaches, or third space, comes from Homi Bhabha. He says that when different cultures interact, the people and the entities, the contexts in that interaction, they are all hybrids in a way that is constructed or networked between them. If we take this to a research setting, Western paradigms and methods cannot be valid because were conceptualized with a static and essentialist mindset, and for Western culture specifically. So we can't really take the boundaries and the classifications of these paradigms and methods seriously, especially if we center Africa in our work. We can even say that using these Western worldviews is a form of colonization in itself, as using it recognizes them will just further perpetuate an understanding of the world in that Euro-Western way, in that way that disregards connections between things. If we take it even further to a research approach theme, we can say that such a third space is about integrative research approaches that is not binary or exclusionary in terms of quantitative, qualitative, but it borrows from them and combine those borrowed elements with some democratic, liberatory, justice-driven, indigenous knowledges and approaches taking the main stage and only using and combining in a way that is suitable for Africa, for indigenous research. There's also another way to approach research, and that is an approach that is not really along the lines of quantitative and qualitative categories. Some decolonial scholars create their own research approaches using the language of decoloniality to position their research in the space between qualitative and quantitative, or in a space beyond qualitative and quantitative. It is also possible to describe your research approach without identifying it as either qualitative or quantitative or mixed, as a way to show that you don't recognize these boundaries. Decoloniality has a relational ontology as well as a relational epistemology. So knowledge in itself is seen or believed to be relational. Researchers who assume this about the nature of reality and the nature of knowledge might call their research approach a relational approach. That is beyond qualitative, quantitative, mixed. It could be all of them, it could be a mix of them, it could be new creative ways of combining them. So methods in such approaches include language frameworks, storytelling, talk circles. And many of the terms that we use to talk about decolonial and indigenous research come to mind, and you might be able to call your research approach something from that vocabulary, something like a contextual research approach, a reflexive approach, a respectful approach. As I said earlier, depending on how radical your approach is, you can use existing approaches and the language from existing approaches, but be specific in your intention and motivation for certain decisions so that your position emerges from your research approach. You can also contextualize methods by adapting them to be more respectful or more reflexive or more relational, or whatever values it is you find missing in the existing ways of speaking about research approaches. Besides a general methodological orientation, research projects are designed or put together in very specific ways, and this is called the research design. Let's look at research designs next. What is a research design? The research design is the overarching framework for methods and techniques, as well as the process that you will use to collect and analyze the data. Some research designs are like rigid and flexed and planned ahead of time and are followed to the letter, like a recipe. This is usually for quantitative work, where control and measurements and strict requirements for validity and reliability, those things are important. Other research designs are more flexible and they will change as the research is carried out. This more flexible design, those are usually associated with qualitative work, or where relational or consultative processes are part of the research. To choose the appropriate research design, you must of course know what will be suitable for your paradigmatic position and your general research approach. But you also need to think about what is actually going to happen. What are you actually going to need in order to investigate your chosen topic? If your study is about perceptions, experiences, interpretations, and feelings of people, for instance, you will need to ask people about their perceptions, their experiences, their interpretations, their feelings. You can't know those things without talking to people. So your design must allow you to ask questions. For instance, conduct interviews or a questionnaire maybe. If your research necessitates you to comment on how people actually behave or what they do, your design must be of such that you can observe people or analyze the communication between people. If your study is about communication messages or communicative interactions via a medium like social media or email, your design must be fit so that you can analyze the content of the communication, or observe, in the case of social media, observe how those interactions play out in a social media platform environment. For your design to fit your study, you have to really think about what it is you will need to address the research problem, or to investigate your topic, or to answer your research questions. Now, I briefly said that some designs are like set types with specific names, and they are like recipes in some cases of what is acceptable for that design and what is not. Other designs are just a systematic discussion of what your research will look like an overview. We can call those ones like unique designs for now. Let's look at some of the different types of research designs, those more set labeled types. There are many types of research designs and so many variations and combinations that we can't talk about everything today. But I will briefly touch on cyclical research designs, combative or disobedient designs, relational designs, participatory and action designs, case study designs, ethnographic designs, and survey designs. Now, cyclical and people-centered designs first. Decolonial and indigenous post-colonial researchers often break away deliberately from linear research designs where one step follows another and opt for a cyclical or circular design, so that the design echoes the interconnectedness and the interdependence of all things that touches in the research process. So it shows interconnections between the different entities involved. For instance, the dead, the living, the yet to be born, the natural world, the human world, and it brings different types of knowledges like dreams and visions and intuitions, historical realities and present day realities together into the research process. So such a design then already, just by being a certain way, recognizes and integrates some of the values and customs of the people that the research is for. So there's an example on the screen of what is called the medicine wheel research design. It is inspired by the Cherokee people, and it shows that interconnection that integrates the research process with existing and established processes and customs. Using cultural principles, ethical frameworks, and metaphors that are intrinsic to, like for us specifically, Africans, to inform our research designs, that is another way used in a decolonial and indigenous setup. 3 of these philosophical psychologies intrinsic to a number of African cultures is Ma'at and Nomo, and then there's also the very well-known Ubuntu. Ma'at refers to the quest for justice and truth and harmony, interrogating the manner in which the research process is in harmony with a culture of the people and pursues issues of truth and justice would be important for Ma'at. And Nomo describes knowledge creation as a vehicle for improvement in human life and human relations. Ubuntu is an ethical framework of sorts with principles of religiosity and respect for self and others, and connectedness and consensus, as well as respect for particularity and historicity. In line with decolonizing our minds, these virtue truths from specific cultural traditions are mixed in with how reality is viewed, how knowledge is viewed, and how our everyday behavior should be, and also how we should be when we are doing research. So then there's no separation between who we are as people, who we are as Africans. We are the same when we do research, and we use then the same ethical principles when we design research projects and use our metaphors and values and processes that are known to us as a people in our design and decisions on research designs. Next, we have what I call combative or disobedient designs. Now, it's actually a bit weird. These are not names of designs necessarily. Decol researchers who choose to be combative or disobedient will probably not call these research designs at all, because the researcher is actively trying to get away from Western ways of framing, of organizing and naming. And the Western ways of calling something a design or giving something a name could be seen as part of Western dehumanization or criminalization or othering of Africans and natives of other regions than their own. And in Western research, Africans would have been the subjects of research, the problem that needs to be solved. And in the decolonial tradition, the more radical version of decolonial tradition, researchers outright rejects this status quo of research design, approach, method, techniques. Those terms we use they are rejected, and the way we generally call things and know things in methodology literature is rejected. In doing this, they disrupt and they question and they displace and they rattle and unsettle the oppressive and alien methodologies to make space for new and liberatory African contextual approaches. And sometimes this necessitates like us to not call a design, if you know what I mean. The decolonial research tradition can be seen as an application of epistemic disobedience. Now, epistemic disobedience is an intentional delinking or decoupling from what is regarded as rational and modern and colonial. When a research design is presented by a decolonial researcher that is created from alternative knowledges, it is immediately disobedient as it confronts the Western methodologies, as it confronts the epistemicide that was permitted and perpetuated by Western ways of creating knowledge. Researchers that take such a position on research design often comes up with their own contextual research methods, such as Imbadu or decolonial critical analysis, when they have to label their research designs. Next up is relational design. Now, Bagele-Chalisa says that indigenous research should make use of social networks and human relationships in designing studies. Such a design puts emphasis on moving the focus from like an individual perspective to a collective perspective, to multiple connections, interconnections, interdependencies between people. She gives one example of such a research design from the Maori people. It's called the Creative Relationship Framework Design. Maybe it's not really translatable to Africa, but I want you to see how cool this is. It's a creative relationship framework, and the research, it goes something like this. The research process starts with a literature review where a variety of sources are consulted to get implicit and explicit understanding of an indigenous view on the research topic. It is not a literature review as we use it in other ways, not an academic literature review, but centering of indigenous understandings and conceptualizations. Then there's a consultation process, something like seminars or community meetings, where the researcher meets with skilled or wise people from the community to consult about the correct way of doing things. They are like elders maybe, or mentors that were gifted special insights or leadership, and they are looked up to for their advice and their wisdom, like those special leader people in whatever the community is. This consultation process is like the research method here. Then there's also a step in the design that comes down to intentionally and reflexively thinking about yourself. So intentionality and reflexivity, where everybody that's participating in the research reflect on their own positions, their own context, and their own relation to everything else that is part of the process. So that's just one example of how the idea of relationality can be part of a research design. Whether this one from the Maori people could be suitable for African context or not is not really a question. It's just interesting to see how it actually influences a research design, if you think about it that way. Now the next type of design is action research. It's about finding a solution to a problem, and action and participatory research designs are usually associated with transformational or critical research, or even suitable for decolonial indigenous positions. Usually it's about a localized problem within a specific setting, and it's about actually doing something about the problem, and usually based on participatory processes. So action research is not about aloof, distanced, ivory tower reflection, but about actually doing something in the real world. Research is not separate from other forms of knowledge, and researchers are not separate from the world. Action research is about researchers joining in the world of politics and problems and knowledges. Action research is designed to be flexible so that changes can be made as possible solutions are applied in real life and the consequences of those possible solutions are considered. It's a process where research findings are applied immediately in the form of an intervention to see whether they are successful in improving or creating change. And action research mainly relies on observational and behavioral data and are not about generalizing or quantifying results. It is making a difference in a specific problem in a specific place. So as you can see from the broad scope of what can be participatory action designs, such research includes can include a number of methods and usually rely on using multiple methods. So in-depth interviews and focus group and observations and surveys, depending on what it is that this specific action or intervention is about. Then I want to talk about case study design shortly. We call case study designs single system designs, because a case study is about research that is focused on one individual, one program, one event, or in the case of organizational communication, many times one organization, for the purposes of getting an in-depth understanding of that organization. Case studies are usually flexible and are suited for exploratory work, and a researcher using such a design cannot generalize their results, but the value of the design is in the intensive investigation into one or a limited number of cases. Case study designs can include a number of methods that could be qualitative or quantitative methods, but the overall design is usually a qualitative in nature, because you get an in-depth understanding of that one organization, for example. And then we get ethnographic designs. Ethnographic designs are for studies that want to get in-depth understanding of a group of people in their natural environment. Typically a community, but that community can take many forms. Online communities like Facebook, like a Facebook group, could be studied by means of something called a virtual ethnographic design. Community can, of course, also be the group of people that work together like staff of an organization. Ethnographic research comes from the field of anthropology, where researchers immerse themselves into the day-to-day lives of communities to study their practices, behaviors, actions, and contexts of that group of people. There are a lot of criticism against like the older way of doing ethnographic research, where foreign researchers, like Western researchers, kind of lurked in the shadow in order to extract information from people and extract information about their lives from a distance. However, today many ethnographic studies are relevant and exciting for communication researchers because online ethnographies and other more respectful versions of ethnographic designs can work well for getting an insider's perspective about what people do in their real life contexts of work or social lives or whatever. Ethnographic designs usually use multiple methods as well, so observation and content analysis and interviewing combined, for instance. And it's usually done over phases, over an extended time. So the research design and the methods can change over time as the situation changes. Then the last kind of fixed design that I want to talk about, because we often use it in organizational research, is survey design. In our department, we usually use the word survey when we refer to the specific research method that involves questionnaires and statistical analysis. However, we could also call a research design a survey design, and then such a design includes questionnaire-based surveys as well as interviews or focus groups. If we see a survey research as a research design, we refer to research that is intended to collect information on people's lifestyles, opinions, attitudes, motives, and also their basic demographic information by asking them about it. A survey design can then include quantitative methods like a self-administered questionnaire, where it's about determining like frequency and distribution and population characteristics so that you can compare and correlate and evaluate and so on. But it can also be about qualitative methods like in-depth interviewing and focus groups that can help a researcher get a better understanding and delve deeper into those attitudes, opinions, lifestyles, and so on. Survey research is often used in organizational contexts, like for business or government research, but it's also found in other social research areas. And then we get to unique designs. I call them that for today. Do you remember at the beginning that I said that a research design is determined by the paradigm, the purpose, the context, and the specific research techniques? Now, you can be an interpretivist, that is your paradigmatic position, that are doing research to explore a topic, that is your purpose or your objectives, in a context of an NGO as an organization, and using partially structured interviews. This list of details could be the outline of what you can call a research design. So for many studies, this will be the way. There will not be one complicated name or labeled research design. Do you remember at the beginning I said that a research design is determined by the paradigm, the purpose, the context, the research approach, and so on. Now, if you are using a research design that doesn't have a specific name or label, some of those other details that is used in determining the way your research project is designed can be used as a kind of a makeshift name. So you can use, for instance, your approach also as a name for your design. So you can say this is a mixed method design, while you also use a mixed method approach. But then your mixed method design is sets out exactly which methods are mixed and how they are mixed. Or a qualitative design, and then your qualitative approach then informs and gives kind of a name to your design as well. You can also use your research objective, like explore or describe or critique, as a name for your design. So you can say an exploratory design if you need to. But it's also possible to not label your design anything. It could be that you are an interpretivist researcher, that's your paradigmatic position, that are doing research to explore a topic, that is your purpose or your objective, in the context of an NGO as an organization, by partially structured interviews. Now, those details could be the backbone, and you could call those details your design. Because it sets out the most important methodological decisions and processes of your research project. Now, also some people go around using some of those paradigmatic and methodological words to make their own creative names for designs. So you can see something like a qualitative content analysis, or a descriptive survey design, or a critical discourse analysis as the name for a design, for a research design. On the screen are some of those examples, but I want you to remember that your research design doesn't necessarily have to be a survey design, a case study design, an ethnographic design. It could be just a description of the different methods and techniques that you are using in your research project. And on that note, I'm going to conclude for the session today. The biggest methodological considerations for a research project is the research approach, or your general orientation in terms of methodology, and your research design. That's the specific framework and the specific way your project is put together. I hope that the information in our session today will give you a start in your search for those methodologies and those approaches and designs that are suitable for the research projects you identify in assignment 2. In our session next week, I will talk you through some questions I received from the class, as well as some other information I think you might find helpful in your work on assignment 2. For today, that's all from me. Goodbye.